The Story of Steam, Part 3, Further Developments in Steam. Welcome to Part 3 of The Story of Steam. We left Part 2 at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830. The railway age had dawned. Now, in Part 3, we cover railway mania and later developments in steam power. Railway mania. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway was an enormous success. The Industrial Revolution took off and large amounts of wealth were created. A new middle class of professionals, managers and civil servants began to emerge. New legislation allowed anyone with money to invest in businesses. The first regulated stock exchange was created in London in 1812, and in 1836 stock exchanges were opened in Manchester and Liverpool. But investments were largely unregulated. Companies, including railways, were promoted as guaranteed to be profitable investments. In the period to 1846, 263 Acts of Parliament setting up new railway companies were passed. But around a third of the routes authorised were never built. Many of the companies collapsed due to poor financial planning, and some were outright fraudulent schemes. As some companies began to fail, the share prices of others faltered and then fell. Many middle-class families lost their entire savings. Larger railway companies bought up the failed schemes for a fraction of the money invested. Over 6,000 miles of railway were built in Great Britain as a result of railway mania, over half of the modern network size. Railway mania was a speculative frenzy, similar to canal mania in the 1790s, and the technology boom and bust period between 1995 and 2000, called the dot-com bubble. George Hudson. George Hudson was a railway entrepreneur who benefited hugely from railway mania. Born near York in 1800, Hudson inherited his uncle's fortune in 1827 and became an investor in railways. By 1836 he was chairman of the York and North Midland Railway, which ran to Leeds. As early as 1837, Hudson was paying shareholder dividends out of capital. Hudson began to expand his railway throughout Yorkshire and beyond. In 1844, he merged his railway interests into the Midland Railway and began to expand it even more widely across England. Among other interests, George Hudson also became chair of the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway, which built the famous high-level bridge across the River Tyne in Newcastle, which opened in 1849. And he took the railway to the border with Scotland, linking with the North British Railway to Edinburgh. With the possible exception of ISAMBARD Kingdom BRUNEL, George Hudson was the greatest railway magnate of the mid-19th century. But all was not as it seemed. In 1848, accusations emerged that Hudson was paying dividends out of capital rather than revenue. Hudson had also borrowed heavily to finance the extraordinary growth of his railway companies. Several inquiries were set up, and Hudson was found to have benefited personally from trading in shares at inflated values, as well as fraudulently using money from his companies to finance other schemes. By 1853, legal cases against him meant he had to sell his properties. He fled England in 1859 to escape a prison term, but returned in 1864 and spent about a year in prison for his debts. He was imprisoned for other debts for a short period in 1865. In 1871, the remaining debtor cases against him were dropped, but he died in December of that year. His funeral cortege drove through the city of York, and many turned out to pay their last respects. George Hudson ruined investors and himself with overambitious schemes and dodgy financial dealings. But he also built a vast railway network, particularly across Yorkshire and the Midlands and further north. His name is remembered in street names in towns and cities across the north of England. Isambard Kingdom BRUNEL. Isambard Kingdom BRUNEL was the other railway colossus of the middle of the 19th century. The merchants in the port of Bristol desired a railway line to London to attract the American trade. Brunel, at the age of 29, was appointed its engineer in 1835. Even at this young age, Brunel was a well-known engineer, having designed the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol in 1831. It had the longest span in the world at the time. He designed many famous bridges over the next 25 years. The Great Western Railway. Appointed Chief Engineer of the Great Western Railway in 1835, Isambard Kingdom Brunel designed a line for the 117 miles route that was as straight as he could make it. This involved considerable earthworks with many cuttings, viaducts, and the famous box tunnel. He designed the railway to use a 7-foot gauge between the rails to enable faster running for the trains and a smoother journey for passengers. The rest of the UK's railways at that time were built to a gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches. The wider gauge meant that through trains couldn't run on the Great Western Railway tracks, and the track began to be converted to the standard gauge from the 1850s. The Great Western Railway opened in stages, being completed to Bristol in 1841. It was extended to Plymouth in Devon in 1849 and reached Penzance in Cornwall in 1867. Isambard Kingdom Brunel died in 1859 at the age of 53, having built one of the most famous and successful railway companies in the world. He was also involved in many other engineering projects and designed the Great Western, launched in 1838, and the longest ship in the world at the time. This was followed by the Great Britain, launched in 1843, and that was the first large iron-hulled and propeller-driven ship in the world. Brunel also designed a prefabricated hospital that was used by Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War and was credited with saving the lives of many wounded soldiers. Steam locomotives. George Stephenson. George Stephenson built the world's first commercially viable railways, and his son Robert opened the world's first locomotive works in 1823. Railways began to spread across North America in the 1830s. As we saw in part 2 of the story of steam, the locomotive Rocket was built for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway by George and Robert Stephenson. It was used on the line between 1830 and 1834, before being replaced. It was capable of pulling a train at a maximum speed of 30 miles per hour, and is now preserved in the Science Museum in London. Robert Stephenson then developed the Planet class of locomotive, which was the first design to be built in large numbers. It featured horizontal cylinders and operated on the Liverpool and Manchester and other railways from around 1830 to 1840. The Planet-style locomotives could regularly pull trains at 30 miles per hour. Daniel Gooch. Isambard Kingdom Brunel appointed Daniel Gooch as Superintendent of Locomotive Engines in 1837. Gooch was 20 years old. He built the GWR Swindon Locomotive Works in 1843 and designed the first locomotives built there. Gooch advanced locomotive design and became chairman of the Great Western Railway in 1865. Daniel Gooch was the chief locomotive engineer for the Great Western Railway from 1837 and introduced the Robert Stephenson designed Star-class engines to the line in 1838. Developments of this design ran until 1871. Gooch then designed the Firefly class of locomotives introduced in 1840. The locomotives were capable of pulling a train at an average speed of 50 miles an hour, a speed unprecedented at the time. 61 locomotives were built to this design, with many remaining in service until the late 1870s. The Iron Duke class was built at Gooch's Swindon Works and introduced from 1847. It offered an average speed of up to 59 miles per hour. Thomas Russell Crampton. Thomas Russell Crampton joined the Great Western Railway as an engineer in 1839. In 1843, he obtained a patent for a new class of locomotive called the Crampton design. This offered several improvements on the locomotives of the time, and his engines operated on lines in England, France and Germany from 1847. Around 300 of the Crampton design locomotives were built. They offered a running speed up to 75 miles per hour on straight, well-laid track. Sir Nigel GRESLEY. Sir Nigel GRESLEY is perhaps the most famous steam locomotive designer of all time. The first steam engines he worked on were the Great North Railway Class 521, introduced in 1911. With modifications, these were later renamed the J6 class when the London and North Eastern Railway was formed. Engines of this class operated until 1960. Nigel GRESLEY designed 28 types of locomotive during his working life. GRESLEY's Class H4, introduced in 1920, had a fully laden running speed of 60 miles per hour. In 1922, GRESLEY's A1 Pacific class locomotives were introduced. These had a running speed of 100 miles per hour. These engines were rebuilt from 1928 as the A3 class, with improvements which allowed a 110 miles per hour running speed. The most famous of the A3 class engines is the Flying Scotsman, which was built as an A1 class and entered service in 1924. It wasn't upgraded to the A3 specifications until 1947. The Flying Scotsman was the first steam locomotive to officially be recorded at 100 miles per hour. It retired in 1963, but was preserved and is now regularly used for steam excursions. In 1935, the A4 design was introduced by Nigel GRESLEY. Of the 35 engines of this class built, Mallard is the most famous and the holder of the world speed record for steam traction at 126 miles per hour. The A4s regularly hauled passenger services at over 100 miles per hour and remained in service until the mid-1960s. The last steam locomotive that Sir Nigel GRESLEY designed was the V4 class, introduced in 1941, the year of his death. Only 2 engines of this class were built, as the London and North Eastern Railway opted for the cheaper-to-build B1 class designed by Edward Thompson. Also in 1941, Nigel GRESLEY designed a prototype electric engine. Production was delayed by the Second World War, and it was introduced on British railways in 1950. It was later classified as Class 76 and remained one of the most reliable electric engines, operating until 1981. The last locomotive I will cover here is the last steam engine to be built in Britain for mainline service. It's the British Rail Class 9F engine called Evening Star. It entered service in 1960, but was withdrawn in 1965 with the intention of preserving her. Evening Star is on display at the National Railway Museum in York. 9 Class 9F engines remain, 3 of which are in a poor state, as the costs of restoration are extremely high. The steam turbine. Charles Parsons. The device that I mentioned that Hero of Alexandria described in part 1 of the story of steam was a simple steam turbine. The possibilities of steam turbines were described by a number of writers over the ages, and a form of steam turbine appears to have been built in France in 1827. However, none were commercially successful until Charles Parsons built a steam turbine connected to an electrical generator in 1884. This development made cheap and plentiful electricity possible and revolutionized marine transport and naval warfare. In 1889, the Newcastle and District Electric Lighting Company installed a Parsons steam turbine in their first power station. The power station, the first to generate electricity from a steam turbine, installed 2 75 kilowatt Parsons engines. Their efficiency was only 1.6%. However, the design of Parsons turbines evolved quickly, and by 1907 his company had installed 3 500 kilowatt generators at the power station. In the same year, a nearby power station was operating 1500 kilowatt generators. Turbinia. In 1897, Parsons had a steam turbine-powered yacht built. He named it Turbinia and exhibited the yacht at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Fleet Review, where it raced around at 39 miles per hour. The fastest ships in the Royal Navy at that time could only achieve 31 miles per hour. Within 2 years, the Royal Navy had 2 destroyers equipped with Parsons steam turbines. The first steam turbine-powered battleship, HMS Dreadnought, was launched in 1906, and the first Parsons-powered transatlantic liners crossed the Atlantic in 1904. The United States Navy launched its first turbine-powered destroyer, USS Smith, in 1909. With a crew of 89, USS Smith was capable of 31 knots, which is 36 miles per hour. The RMS Titanic, which sank on their maiden voyage in 1912, used a combination of traditional coal-fired steam engines coupled with one Parsons steam turbine producing 12,000 kilowatts. The turbine was fed by exhaust steam from the other engines to increase its efficiency. Modern nuclear-powered ships and submarines and nuclear power plants still use steam turbines. Steam turbine locomotives. The idea of powering locomotives using steam turbines gained traction in the late 1920s. Steam turbines are highly efficient at high speed and with less moving parts are potentially more reliable than piston-driven steam engines. 3 steam turbine-powered locomotives of different designs entered service in Germany in 1927 and 1928, and other European countries developed prototypes and experimental engines. The London, Midland and Scottish Railway introduced the LMS Turbomotive in 1935. It drew passenger trains for 11 years before the turbine failed, and it was converted to piston drive. In 1944, the Pennsylvania Railroad introduced the largest direct-drive steam turbine locomotive in the world, the S2. It had a maximum power output of 6,900 horsepower. Terribly inefficient at low speeds, it was retired in 1949 and, sadly, scrapped. As well as direct transmission from the steam turbine, a number of locomotives were built where the steam turbine was used to generate electricity for electric transmission. 2 engines built in the United Kingdom performed poorly and were scrapped. In the United States, General Electric built 2 oil-fired steam turbine electric locomotives in 1938. They were scrapped in 1943, having performed poorly. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway introduced 3 coal-fired steam turbine electric locos in 1947, but they were unreliable and expensive to maintain and were scrapped in 1950. The Norfolk and Western Railway tried a similar design in 1954, but it too was unreliable and was withdrawn in 1958. Thus ended the experiments with steam turbine locomotives. The main problem with the use of steam turbines in railway engines is that, although very efficient at high speeds, they are extremely inefficient at low speeds. The need to regularly stop at stations or signals and start up again destroys the speed and efficiency advantages that the turbine might offer. In addition, steam turbines are heavy and only work in one direction, which was a problem for the direct drive locomotives. The steam engine today. The steam engine today. The steam turbine continues to be used in power applications, notably with nuclear power. The steam locomotive has almost entirely fallen out of use, except for heritage lines and visitor attractions. However, some rack and pinion mountain railways in Austria and Switzerland have been converted back to steam from diesel, as modern steam engines produce less pollutants. And the low-pressure steam engine that started the Industrial Revolution? James Watt designed fell out of use in the 19th century as electricity became the main source of power in factories. But there may yet be a place for the low-pressure steam engine as technologies advance with a focus on carbon neutrality. Low-pressure engines are cheap to build and easy to maintain, and the University of Southampton in England are researching modern versions of Watt's engine that can be used to generate electricity from waste heat in industry. Likewise, there may be a place for modern designs of steam engine for use in conjunction with geothermal energy and solar thermal collectors. There may be life in the steam engine yet. This is the third and final part of the story of steam. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.